Hello, everyone. My name is Will Cullen, Schwarzman Scholar Fellow at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Joining me today is Kelly Sims Gallagher, Academic Dean and Professor of Energy and Environmental Policy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Our subject today is climate finance and opportunities for the United States and China to accelerate low-carbon development abroad. Dr. Gallagher, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's first introduce the concept to our audience. What is climate finance, and why is it important for achieving global climate goals?
Well, at the most basic level, climate finance is finance that is intended to support the low carbon transition. And by that, we mean transitioning from fossil fuel-based energy systems to clean energy-based systems, and or adaptation and resilience measures. So think, building a seawall to protect your coastline from sea level rise. And I think it's also important to remember that when we talk about climate finance, there's the public finance, that which is paid for by governments, and also private finance. And so we have a number of institutions around the world that we think of as more public institutions that are providers of climate finance, like the World Bank or the Green Climate Fund, but also private capital is financing a lot of these transitions as well.
In your recent Foreign Affairs article on the coming carbon tsunami, you highlight the importance of creating a new growth model that's low carbon for developing countries. What are the current barriers to the clean energy transition in these countries, and how might the United States and China help to create a better enabling policy condition in these countries?
Well, I think we have to step back for a second and think about what are the development models that exist out there. If you are a developing country in Africa, say, and you're trying to look to other countries for models for economic development and now sustainable economic development, you could look at the United States and its an industrial revolution, which of course really started in Europe, but was adopted in the United States. And then the big post-war growth period in the United States, starting in 1945. So you could look at the U.S. growth model, but to be clear, that was a growth model largely fueled by coal and oil, and more recently, natural gas. I think many developing countries in Africa and Asia now also look at China's development model, and that's become a term, the China development model. And this is essentially adopts what was previously termed the East Asian growth model, really, which was pioneered in South Korea and in Taiwan and in Japan. Formerly known as the Tigers. And this too was a pretty carbon intensive development model. It was really a state-led development model that relied heavily on investments in manufacturing, and in some cases, very heavy manufacturing. Think iron, steel, cement, infrastructure industries that rely very heavily on coal, even still today. So the essence of the challenge is that we don't have a clean development model. We don't have any evidence that you can achieve the very substantial economic growth and poverty alleviation that China has, for example, where in the space of really 30 years, hundreds of millions of people have been brought out of poverty, have been given, good, improved, better jobs over time. But it came at this tremendous expense to the environment, both the kind of conventional environmental issues like urban air pollution and water pollution, but also, of course, in terms of CO2 emissions. China went from not being in the top 10 of the global greenhouse gas emitters to now accounting for 40% or almost 40% now of global greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, its economic rise was accompanied by a very substantial rise in greenhouse gas emissions.
Absolutely. And so to step back, what's the current landscape of climate finance, both in the US and in China? Who are the main actors, companies, and organizations that provide climate financing abroad? And are these from the private or public sector?
So that's a great question, because this landscape isn't mirrored perfectly, you know, across the two countries. We have multilateral development banks, and there's some intersection between the United States and China with the multilateral development banks. For example, both the United States and China are voting members of the World Bank, but some of those multilateral development banks have a stronger influence from the United States than from China, and others have stronger influence from China as compared with the United States. For example, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which the US hasn't even joined as a member. And then we also have national financing agencies in the United States, a relatively new agency. Very important tool for the United States is the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, known as the DFC. And of course, the United States has typically had an Ex-Im Bank, though it temporarily suspended operations during the Trump administration, but is now back in business. China has what are known as its policy banks. These are state-owned banks that serve the interests of the Chinese government. And the two main examples are China's Development Bank, the China Development Bank, and China's Ex-Im Bank. And a kind of different form of institution, I think, in China is its now famous Belt and Road Initiative, which is a major initiative intended to finance infrastructure investments around the world in developing countries. And of course, there's also some geopolitical dimensions to this, where China is fostering stronger relationships with these countries where it's making major BRI investments. The United States hasn't really had a counterpart to that until very recently, when President Biden proposed a new initiative called the Build Back Better World, or B3W.
And so to follow up on that, do you think there are opportunities for the Belt and Road Initiative and Build Back Better World to either complement each other in developing countries to help accelerate financing? And what would that look like?
Yes, well, we're in a very difficult political environment between the United States and China right now. In fact, in the 25 years that I've been studying China, I feel like we're at the most difficult point in U.S. China relations at this time. So it's quite difficult to envision cooperative activities between the two governments right now. But if there were one area that I could pick where the US and China would work together, it would be on overseas development finance for this clean, low carbon, climate resilient transition. And I think in many respects, it would be a very rational and self-interested cooperative activity. Because first of all, China has a lot of capacity for overseas development finance, as we've seen through the Belt and Road Initiative, with hundreds of billions of dollars being spent since the Belt and Road Initiative was established. And the United States, having extensive experience and many more decades of experience doing these types of overseas development investments, and doing it in an environmentally and socially responsible way for the most part. Not that the US record has been perfect. And there's an overwhelming need in many of these developing countries to have access to finance, because it's not as if these countries necessarily want to have a carbon intensive development pathway, but they lack both the policy infrastructure, if that's a way to put it, and the finance to actually be able to achieve the transition. And I think the US and China could partner in these third-party countries to work on overseas development finance. If it proved, too politically contentious to do that, it's still possible for the US and China to be, financing in parallel projects in developing countries. And maybe that could, ensure sort of a race to the top, in that the United States, which has already been, I think, motivated to develop an alternative to the BRI, becomes more active in helping developing countries with overseas development finance. And the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, in fact, gives us this opportunity that didn't exist until recently with its current $60 billion authorization from Congress, to really be able to mobilize significant new funding. And they have committed, a large proportion of that $60 billion to go towards climate-related finance.
I wanted to ask about a recent breakthrough at the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow last year that you mentioned in your Foreign Affairs article, about how developed countries came together to provide $8.5 billion to help finance South Africa's clean energy transition. I was wondering, why is this successful, and how might it serve as a model for other countries?
I think the main reason why it could be successful is that it was a very pragmatic agreement. So I think it's worth stepping back for a minute to sort of talk about the antecedents of global climate finance, because, as many people know, in an earlier climate agreement, the industrialized countries around the world had committed to generate $100 billion per year in climate finance from both public and private sources by the year 2020. It was acknowledged last year at the Conference of Parties in Glasgow that the industrialized world had failed to achieve that goal. And that was, very much perceived as a broken promise by developing countries. But I think one of the reasons why it proved difficult for industrialized countries to mobilize that funding was because it was in large part being channeled to institutions that they didn't necessarily control, like the Green Climate Fund. And I think for unclear purposes. So what's nice about the South Africa deal is that South Africa said, we have these specific barriers facing us as we are trying to address the low carbon transition in South Africa. We have a state utility, Eskom, that is bankrupt. We rely heavily on coal, and we need to create jobs for energy workers. So they very clearly identified their barriers, and they said, we would be willing to make these transitions if you can help us solve these core challenges. And so the deal that's been announced, which of course still has to be manifested into reality, is a very pragmatic deal to help bring Eskom out of bankruptcy, to do a job creation program, and to begin to invest in cleaner forms of energy.
You mentioned earlier about the kind of shifting political climates looking back on it when you're serving in the Obama administration, the 2014 U.S. China joint announcement on climate change was a unique breakthrough that many scholars argue led to the global support for the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. So currently, as you mentioned earlier, the political sentiment has clearly shifted from cooperation more towards competition. I'm curious to hear, given the current political landscape, if you think that the US and China could outcompete each other in developing countries to accelerate financing, and if you think this would lead to better mitigation and larger climate action globally.
Well, in the context of the 2015 joint announcement and the subsequent 2015 joint statement, in fact, I think the two countries were beginning to compete with each other on climate finance. The United States, under the Obama administration, made a $3 billion commitment to the Green Climate Fund. And in response, the Chinese committed to a $3.2 billion commitment through a new fund that they said they would establish called the South-South Fund on Climate Change. One challenge has been that China has not publicly revealed how it has deployed its renminbi or dollars, and however it's denominated, in the context of the South-South Fund on Climate Change. But that's an example of the two countries trying to, compete in a good way to mobilize funding to support developing countries. And I think that could keep happening in the future. But I think we could go further than just kind of competing on the levels of funding and actually start to think about some cooperation models that would be acceptable, for both countries. So maybe it is establishment of a joint institution like a Green Development Bank, a global Green Development Bank that could be co-financed by the United States and China, and of course other countries as well. Or we could look at different, financial arrangements where there's co-financing from the United States and China, and maybe even also bringing in private actors to support different projects in developing countries.
I wanted to also ask about the role of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. Right now, it's co-chaired by both the US and China. What's the importance of creating standards and harmonizing those standards with kind of international norms, and how might the US and China work together on that?
Yes, I was always personally disappointed that the United States didn't join the AIIB because I thought that was a lost opportunity precisely to work on this question of norm development together. So, and I should note that many European countries did join the AIIB, and I think have worked with that institution on development of social safeguards and environmental standards in the context of the AIIB's development finance. And in fact, AIIB was one of the first multilateral development banks to announce it was going to not support coal plants and in a more positive way support renewable energy. And I should also note that the new development bank, otherwise known as the BRICS Bank, also made that commitment very, very early. So I think that there's great potential, even if it seems like a politically daunting task for the US and China to work together on a new institution together for a climate constrained world. You might think of this as sort of a renewal of the Bretton Woods institutions and maybe consideration of new institutions fit for purpose for the challenges we face today.
Definitely. And I was also curious to hear your thoughts on the current geopolitical and economic tensions, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and inflation, and how those larger global issues will potentially hinder global climate action and finance?
I definitely think Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's, the delicate dance that China is apparently playing, at least in not condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, makes things much, much more complicated for the United States in terms of U.S. China cooperation. And I also think that China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic has also complicated matters. I contrast what has happened over the last 2 years with the Ebola crisis, which I think many people have long forgotten about. But actually, in the Ebola crisis, the United States and China began working together rather closely on standing up field hospitals in Africa and working together on the ground in these third-party countries. But we haven't seen that kind of cooperation on vaccine development, vaccine distribution, and certainly not on transparent, exchange of information during the last 2 years. So all of these complicate matters for sure. But I think that most people recognize, even pragmatists, that if we want to be able to solve the climate change issue, we have to have a modicum of cooperation between the United States and China, not only in terms of, how they're going to reduce their own emissions as the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases today, but also in this quest to support developing countries in financing, this new development model and the low carbon transition.
And going back to your own experience, traveling in China, researching in China, studying in China, what's the importance of the people-to-people exchanges and research, involving policy support between the US and China, and how does that make a difference in terms of climate cooperation?
Well, I'm a big believer in people-to-people exchanges because it's always important to remember that China is not some one unified actor, but you have a diversity of actors within China. You have the party, you have an administrative side of the government, and of course you have a very robust, gigantic civil society. And so certainly for me, in all of my trips to China and study of China, I have spent a lot of time, walking through and learning about factories and industrial production there, teaching classes, getting to know other faculty and students, and of course, learning a lot. And this has a way of demystifying, a country that is mystifying to many Americans, right? And I think conversely, the possibility of bringing Chinese students and scholars into the United States offers those exact same opportunities. And in the climate domain, many of us academics have interacted with each other for many years. We've hosted scholars here at the Fletcher School, and previously when I was at the Kennedy School at Harvard, who have gone on to serve important roles in the international climate negotiations. And conversely, I've also spent time, and others in the U.S. government have spent time in China. And I think the understanding that is built up by these exchanges and the interactions between the two can reduce mistrust and kind of level set the formal negotiations between the United States and China, but also can lead to creative thinking because the two sides don't have to be quite so positional, but rather can think about how to bring, the mutual interest together to support, positive outcomes for the climate.
As we look towards 2022 and towards the COP in Egypt in November, what's on your wish list in terms of what you would like to see get done going into it? If you had, a 5-minute talk with leaders in both countries, what would you tell them to do?
Well, I think as we look ahead to COP27, there's no question that we've hit sort of an inflection point in history, I think, precisely because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it has made more obvious to Europe and of course to the United States that these choices about the composition of your energy supply, can have really big impacts in terms of your own national and economic security. And I think China is also thinking about that too. It's watching what's happening with the sanctions. China had just agreed in the context of the Xi Jinping-Putin agreement in February to a new pipeline arrangement where it was going to begin importing more natural gas from Russia. And China must be thinking about whether or not it really wants to rely on China in terms of importing natural gas. So I think what's going to be at the front of everybody's minds is how do these two challenges intersect with each other? This challenge of energy security and this challenge of climate security, and trying to find pathways, technical pathways and policy pathways that can serve both goals, enhancing energy security and enhancing energy and climate security. So we might think about, for example, cooperation on heat pumps. We might be thinking about renewable energy coupled with storage and battery storage. In fact, the Biden administration has just recently indicated it's going to activate the Defense Production Act in precisely to enhance U.S. manufacturing capacity for battery storage. And so I think all of this in a way is colliding at the same time. We have the new IPCC report indicating we have, but a decade to really turn the tide if we want to have a chance of avoiding very significant climate change. And I think it's also clear there's a pretty short time horizon, particularly for Europe, in making a decisive change in its energy systems to enhance its own energy security.
So before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so, but I very much enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for having me.
Likewise. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.